Previously on Warhammer 40,000, Beneath the Moor, following a strangely effortless victory against a Tyranid scouting force, the crew of the Indomitable Wrath was dispatched on a recon mission to investigate a silent Imperial outpost on the moon, Vrohn-Theta. As they drew closer, they intercepted horrific distress calls, evidence of ships being consumed from the inside, screaming voices lost to digestion, and the terrifying implication that something inhuman is watching them. Upon arrival, they found the outpost annihilated, devoured by tendrils from orbiting Tyranid bioships, which continued harvesting not just flesh, but metal, stone, and earth. The Tyranids ignored the Imperial ships entirely. The implication was chilling. The Imperium is beneath their notice. The fleet retreated, shaken and back aboard the Indomitable Wrath. Silence gripped the crew. Doubt festered. Commanders reflected. Officers grew haunted. And the ship's morale began to unravel. Captain Gaius sent their findings to the battle fleet, which is now bracing for a conflict they fear they cannot win. The Hive fleet has not attacked yet. It is watching, waiting, feeding. And the Indomitable Wrath, along with the rest of the Imperial fleet, may already be inside its jaws. Aboard the Indomitable Wrath, en route to the battle fleet. The silence on the Indomitable Wrath was heavier than the void itself. The bridge crew, so often filled with clipped orders and military precision, had fallen into a collective stillness, their voices reduced to murmurs, their movements almost mechanical. The enormity of what they had seen, the absolute reduction of the Vrohn-Theta outpost into raw, mindless consumption, sat in their chests like a lead weight. Captain Havelock Gaius stood at the central command pulpit, his expression unreadable as he watched the warp-distorted streaks of light outside the viewport. The jump back to the battle fleet's position had been routine. No warp anomalies, no mechanical failures, no sudden signs of pursuit from the Hive fleet. And yet, it had been the longest 5 hours of his life. No one spoke of what they had seen, not yet, because to speak of it was to acknowledge that the same fate awaited them all.
Approaching the battle fleet,
announced Helmsmaster Orin Vale, his usual bravado absent. His hands moved across the controls with automatic precision, but his eyes were unfocused, his thoughts clearly elsewhere.
Disengaging engines, thrusters engaged.
A ripple of activity spread across the bridge as the fleet materialized ahead of them. A vast, terrible wall of Imperial might. Warships of all sizes loomed in the darkness, an armada of steel and fire, their hulls adorned with golden aquilus, Saint-Statue, and purity seals that fluttered in the artificial winds of their docking stations. The battle fleet was a fortress in the void, assembled for one purpose: to hold the line against the Hive fleet. And yet, after what they had seen, could such a thing even be done?
Master of Vox,
Gaius said, turning to Arlen Yast, who had been unusually quiet since the encounter. Just blinked, as if snapping back to reality.
Aye, Captain.
transmit our report to Fleet Command. Secure channel.
Just nodded, fingers working across the Vox panel with numb efficiency. Within seconds, the encrypted data packet containing everything they had seen was launched toward the fleet's command vessel, a mighty Retribution-class battleship, the Emperor's Will. Gaius exhaled through his nose. It was done. The High Admirals would know. Whether they would understand was another matter. As the data transfer completed, Gaius turned away from the command pulpit.
Voss,
he said, voice quieter than usual. First Officer Linara Voss looked up from where she had been leaning over a hololithic display. eyes slightly bloodshot as if she had been holding her breath for hours.
Yes, Captain?
Dismiss the bridge crew for the next cycle. Keep essential personnel only.
She hesitated as if wanting to object, but stopped herself.
Aye, sir.
Gaius nodded, stepping toward the bridge's exit.
I need to think.
No one questioned him. Not today. While the bridge maintained a thin veil of order, the lower decks were fraying at the edges. Voidsmen, junior officers, and maintenance crews moved with haunted expressions, their conversations hushed, their gazes unfocused. The corridors of the ship, normally filled with the clatter of boots and the steady drone of marching orders, were strangely subdued. The crew had seen the records of Vrohn-Theta's fate. They had heard the sounds of the blessed resolve being devoured. And now they understood. This was not war. War was a battle between foes, a contest of firepower, of tactics, of faith and blood. This was something else. This was the end of all things. Chief Medicae Veria Solis stood over the surgical table, her hands clasped behind her back. She was staring at a glass vial of pain suppressants, but she wasn't seeing it. She was seeing the outpost being stripped of everything. She was hearing the voxes filled with screams. The door hissed open and Master of Vox Arlen Jast stepped inside.
Figured I'd find you here.
Jast muttered. Solis glanced at him, her usual sharp demeanor dulled by exhaustion.
And where else would I be?
Jast leaned against the nearest Medicae station, running a hand through his disheveled hair.
What do you make of all this?
Solis exhaled.
I make of it what it is.
She looked at him, voice like iron.
We are already dead, Just.
Just winced. He laughed, but it was hollow.
Great bedside manner, Doc.
I'm a Medicae,
Solis murmured.
not a priest.
Just shook his head, rubbing his temples.
I keep thinking about that last transmission.
He muttered.
About that sound.
They both knew what he meant. That scream. The one that had not ended. The one that had become something else.
You think they were still alive?
Just asked. His voice quieter now.
Inside that thing.
Solis' expression darkened.
Not in any way that mattered.
Neither of them spoke after that. Gaius sat alone in his private quarters, a single lumen casting his face into harsh relief. The room was filled with data slates, old battle reports, relics of past campaigns. But none of it mattered. Not anymore. He reached for the half-empty bottle of Amasec, pouring himself a glass with slow, deliberate precision. He had seen entire fleets burn to ash. He had seen hives fall to chaos, to orcs, to the dark hunger of the void. But never like this. This was different. Because this time there was nothing to fight. There was only consumption. A slow, unstoppable feeding that would take every soldier, every ship, every prayer and digest them into nothing. He took a long sip, feeling the burn travel down his throat. His mind drifted back to the Blessed Resolve's final transmission. That voice, that thing. The Hive Fleet was out there, waiting, watching, adapting, and soon the real war would begin. But deep down, Gaius could not shake the feeling that it was not a war at all. It was a meal, and they were already inside its jaws. Aboard the Indomitable Wrath. Arrival at the battle fleet, 10 hours since Vrohn-Theta. The Imperial battle fleet hung in orbit above Vandium Prime, an iron phalanx of warships assembled for the inevitable confrontation. Against the darkness of the void, The ships gleamed like ancient leviathans, their adamantium hulls scarred by centuries of conflict. Frigates, cruisers, and battleships moved in tight, defensive formations, their gun batteries primed, their lance arrays standing silent, waiting for the first order to fire. It was a fleet designed for slaughter. And yet, after what Captain Havelock Gaius had seen at Vrohn-Theta, he knew the truth. It would not be enough. The Indomitable Wrath slowed as it entered formation, docking with one of the larger command vessels, a Retribution-class battleship. The Emperor's Will. It was a monolith of war, its hull engraved with golden Imperial script. Massive prayer banners fluttering in the void's artificial winds. Gaius and First Officer Linara Voss walked through the docking corridor, their boots clanking against the steel decking, the air thick with recycled incense and the distant hum of servitors. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say. They had seen what the Hive Fleet did to the weak. Now they would see if the Imperium was any different. The briefing chamber was a cold, sterile place. It was a war room, not a council hall. Everything inside was designed for efficiency, for the quick and brutal dissection of war strategies. At its center, a hololithic display flickered with shifting data. Fleet formations, augur reports, recon data from the outer void. At the head of the chamber stood Fleet Admiral Galadius Rowe, his expression stone-hard, his uniform immaculate despite the exhaustion beneath his eyes. Around him, other senior commanders, captains, and naval officers stood in grim silence. Gaius and Voss stepped forward, saluting.
Captain Gaius, First Officer Voss, report exactly what you saw to me. A few of us are in disbelief.
Gaius inhaled, keeping his voice measured.
Vrohn-Theta is gone. The outpost has been stripped to the bedrock. The Tyranids did not just consume the personnel. They took everything.
Rowe narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening.
We encountered no survivors.
Voss added, voice steady despite the weight in it.
The Hive Fleet has begun feeding well ahead of its projected engagement. They are already here, Admiral. They are just waiting to strike.
The hololithic display shifted, revealing the massive void mass beyond the system's edge. The Hive Fleet. It had not yet arrived, but it lurked there, a gargantuan shape, shifting with unfathomable hunger, its full extent hidden beyond the augur ranges. It was close, and it was watching. Rowe's voice was quiet, but filled with steel.
We have been tracking their movement.
He said, his gaze sweeping the room.
Your report only confirms what we already suspected.
He turned back to the holo display, tapping a gloved finger against the fleet formations.
We have been waiting for them, conducting reconnaissance, calculating their movement. We know they will come, and we will be ready.
Gaius studied the display. He could see how much had been invested into this defense. The thousands of ships, the millions of personnel, the sheer unrelenting might of the Imperial Navy. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he saw Vrohn-Theta. He saw the blessed resolve, its crew screaming as they were digested alive. He saw the tendrils sinking into the moon's surface, stripping it of everything that had ever existed. And he wondered, in the depths of his mind, was this fleet just another outpost waiting to be devoured? Rowe turned back to them, his voice sharp, unwavering.
Your orders are simple, Captain. Your frigate will be deployed in the battle line formation, alongside other support ships, to engage the Hive Fleet upon arrival. You will hold the enemy advance. You will not break.
He held Gaius's gaze as if daring him to doubt it.
Understood?
Gaius held the Admiral's stare for 3 long seconds. He did not voice his doubts, because doubts had no place in the Imperium of man. He saluted.
Understood, sir.
Good.
Rowe looked at the officers around him.
The hive approaches. Ready your ships. War is upon us.
The chamber erupted into motion. By the time Gaius and Voss returned to the bridge, the air had changed. The crew felt it. They knew what was coming. All along the bridge, officers were preparing, finalizing targeting solutions, running tactical drills, adjusting shield frequencies. And in the center of it all, Gaius stood, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression grim.
Battle stations.
His voice carried across the bridge, steady as iron.
Prepare for engagement. The hive fleet is coming.
The klaxons wailed. Red emergency lumens flickered, and in the cold abyss beyond the viewport, the shadow of the hive fleet began to move. Aboard the Indomitable Wrath. 12 hours after last contact with the hive fleet. The waiting was the worst part. Every soul aboard the Indomitable Wrath knew what was coming. They had seen the reports, heard the distant vox whispers of slaughter at Vrohn-Theta, and had spent every waking moment bracing for the inevitable. Now, the inevitable had arrived.
Contact!
The shout came from Master of Augurs Tyrus Hale, his fingers a blur over the augur displays. His cybernetic eyes flickered with raw data streams as he processed the incoming horror. Gaius did not speak. He only turned, coldly, waiting for confirmation. Hale swallowed. Hard.
Hive fleet has begun its approach.
On the holo display, the incoming mass of biological warforms bloomed into view, an ever-expanding maelstrom of life-consuming monstrosities. From this distance, they were still small, but that illusion would not last.
Size?
Voss asked, though she already knew the answer. Hale ran a hand down his tactical console, confirming what they all suspected.
Vast.
His voice was flat, but beneath it lurked something else, something close to dread.
Augur readings can't track their full scale. The fleet is shifting, reforming, growing. They've adapted to our scans.
Of course they have,
muttered Ren Vargas, standing at his tactical station. His hands tightened around the railings as he studied the impossibly large, pulsing mass beyond the fleet's augur reach.
If they know how we see, they know how to hide.
A chill settled across the bridge. Captain Havelock Gaius stepped forward, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the encroaching abyss beyond the viewport.
Time to contact.
Hale exhaled.
40 minutes until full engagement.
A grim murmur spread across the bridge.
Then we hold the line.
Gaius said simply. The words should have been reassuring. They were not. Because the Tyranids would not be held. The fleet's Vox channel erupted with battle chatter.
All ships, weapons free.
Void shields at maximum. Incoming wave detected.
By the throne, there's so many of them.
Then, the first shots lanced through the void. From the great Retribution-class battleships, lance batteries burned through the darkness, their white-hot spears of energy igniting against the chitinous walls of bioships. Macro cannons thundered, unleashing kiloton volleys of destruction, tearing through the darkness in waves of pure, unrelenting force. Torpedoes launched blazing trails of fire and death. The hive fleet convulsed as the first impacts struck home. The smaller vanguard bioships ruptured, their bodies splitting apart like bursting tumors, acidic ichor spewing into the void. It was the first time in hours that the fleet had allowed itself to hope. Then the hive fleet kept moving. Gaius's grip tightened behind his back. They were supposed to slow down. They were supposed to reform, adjust their swarm tactics to the firestorm of ordnance being hurled into their ranks. But the Tyranids were still coming. And worse, they were moving faster.
That should have stopped them.
Voss murmured. Gaius did not respond, because she was wrong. Chief Engineer Revis 9 spoke next, his mechanical monotone unwavering.
Auger feeds confirm,
he said, adjusting the ship's internal data pulse.
Hive fleet velocity increasing. Estimated 24% acceleration beyond projected limits. Calculations suggest an anomaly in their evolutionary adaptation.
Voss turned, face hard.
Explain.
Revis 9's red cybernetic optics blinked as he fed new data into the bridge's hollow display.
They are adapting to our firepower in real time,
he said.
Instead of retreating or shifting strategy, they are simply accelerating. Brute force, no pattern shifts, no hesitation.
Vale exhaled through his teeth.
They want this fight.
A voice cut through the bridge's noise.
All sub-fleet forces stand by for assault orders.
The message came from Fleet Command. A silence fell over the bridge. Then...
Sub-fleet detachment Gamma. Advance. Engage the enemy. Stall their approach.
For a moment, no one moved. Because the reality of it settled in all too quickly. They were not being sent to win. They were being sent to die. Gaius did not hesitate. He pressed a single command rune on his pulpit.
All hands to battle stations.
The bridge erupted into controlled chaos. Officers rushed to consoles. Targeting augers began calibrations. Gunners moved to firing stations. Commissar Julian Orfield stood at the bridge's central aisle, his cold gaze sweeping the crew.
Fear is weakness,
he said, his voice iron hard.
The Emperor watches us. We do not falter. We do not break.
And yet even he could not hide the flicker of unease. Voss turned to Gaius, voice quiet.
We are being thrown into a grinder.
Gaius nodded once.
Yes.
Vale at the helm was more blunt.
So we're just, what, cannon fodder?
We are a delaying action.
Gaius corrected. He turned to face the entire bridge crew, his voice commanding, steady despite the dread creeping into their bones.
Our orders are clear. Engage, stall, survive. We will hold the line long enough for Fleet Command to determine the Tyranids' full offensive strategy. We are not meant to win, but we are not meant to die either.
His eyes hardened.
We go in, we stall them, we get out.
Silence. Then... Voss nodded. Hale exhaled sharply. Vargas tightened his grip on his console. Vale shook his head, but he smirked.
Well, hell, Captain, when you put it that way, it almost sounds doable.
Jast laughed nervously.
I've placed worse bets.
Commissar Orfiel simply clasped his gloved hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. They had no choice, so they would fight, and maybe they would even live.
Helm,
Gaius said, his voice cold.
Advance to engagement range.
Vale cracked his neck, fingers tightening on the controls.
Aye, Captain.
The Indomitable Wrath lurched forward, its engines flaring as it spearheaded its sub-fleet detachment toward the hive fleet. The Tyranids were still coming, still hungry, still waiting, and now the Imperial ships were charging toward them, because there was no other option, because this was the only way forward, because they were already inside the jaws of the beast, and soon those jaws would snap shut. Engagement range. Edge of the Hive Fleet. Subfleet Gamma. Imperial Battle Fleet. Vandium Prime Defense Line. The first thing that hit them was the silence. For a fraction of a second, in the endless void between engagement range and utter annihilation, there was no sound but the cold, metallic hum of warships surging forward, their engines cutting across the abyss. Then, as if the universe itself had been holding its breath, the silence was shattered.
Contact!
Master of Augurs Tyrus Hale yelled over the Vox, his hands flying over the Augur console. His cybernetic augmetics flickered erratically as they struggled to process the impossible mass of biological signatures swelling before them.
The Hive Fleet is moving to intercept.
The hollow display erupted in a mass of red runes, thousands of blipping organic life forms surging forward at impossible speeds. They had been waiting. The moment the subfleet reached the threshold of the enemy line, the Hive Fleet erupted into motion. The black was consumed in chitin and flesh, an ocean of bioships flowing forward like a great writhing tidal wave, their organic forms undulating with unnatural movement. And then it began. The opening salvos were immediate. The Imperial frigates and cruisers unleashed a brutal barrage of fire, macro cannons booming, lance batteries igniting the darkness with searing plasma spears. Torpedoes streaked forward, their contrails painting the void in burning, white-hot trails of light. The first Tyranid vessels detonated under the assault. Their bodies ruptured like rotting fruit, splattering the void with sickly green bioplasma, their carcasses drifting lifelessly. A brief moment of hope. Then the true attack began.
"Frigate Persecutor is gone,"
shouted Renvargus. The bridge voxes erupted in screams as one of their escorting frigates was engulfed whole. The bioships did not explode like Imperial ships did. They did not burn. They fed. Massive tendrils lashed out, wrapping around the Persecutor's hull, pulling it toward a massive, Moor-lined vessel, a living predator the size of a battleship. The ship's void shields failed within seconds. Its hull was pierced, split open like the shell of an insect. Torrents of fluid poured inside. Not fire, not air displacement, but digestive enzymes. The screams over the Vox changed. They did not end in explosions, in the static of death, but in wet, gurgling sounds. The voices dissolving, stretching into something inhuman, then silence. The Persecutor was gone. On the bridge of the Indomitable Wrath, Captain Havelock Gaius stood unmoving, his face stone, his hands clenched behind his back.
"Target the feeding tendrils,"
he snapped.
"Sever them before they latch onto the rest of the fleet."
"Targeting solutions locked,"
Vargas
barked. Gaius didn't hesitate.
"Fire."
The Indomitable Wrath's macro cannons roared, their payloads slamming into the pulsating limbs of the Hive Fleet's feeding monstrosities. The rounds connected. Tendrils burst apart, leaking organic ichor into the void. The Tyranid bioforms reeled back momentarily, their limbs twitching and curling in sudden, alien pain.
Confirmed kill.
Hale called out.
One of the feeder beasts is slowing.
Gaius said nothing. They needed more than that. All around them, the subfleet was being consumed. A cruiser was split down the middle as a massive bladed organism burst from a bioship's underbelly, carving through adamantium plating like paper. One of the destroyers managed to evade a horrific death, only to be bombarded by streams of acid spewing from a Tyranid bioweapon, its hull melting away in seconds. The Vox was filled with panic.
"We can't stop them! We can't!"
They're inside. They're
Incoming.
Silence. Gaius clenched his jaw. Damn it all. First Officer Linara Voss stood beside Gaius, her expression hard, unreadable.
This isn't a battle.
She said, voice low.
It's a feeding ground.
Gaius inhaled slowly, keeping his face impassive. He turned to Orin Vale at the helm.
Full evasive maneuvers. Now.
Vale's hands tightened on the controls, his usual cocky demeanor now laced with iron focus.
Aye, Captain.
The Indomitable Wrath rolled hard to starboard, weaving between the wreckage of its dying fleetmates. The maneuver was impossibly close, scraping past a bioship's expanding maw. The interior lined with pulsating teeth, grinding against each other like some nightmarish ribcage.
We're clear.
Vale called, sweat beading on his forehead.
Not for long,
Vargas muttered. From the lower decks, Chief Engine Seer Revis 9 was engaged in his own war. The machine spirits of the ship were screaming, data feedback flooding the Mechanicum consoles. The ship's systems were straining, void shields fluctuating from the sheer mass of organic tendrils lashing across the hull. Revis 9 did not panic. He only moved, augmentic limbs twitching as he overloaded backup conduits, forcing raw energy into the reactor core, stabilizing the failing power grid.
The flesh betrays,
he murmured, his voice calm despite the chaos.
Only the machine endures.
A great blast of energy surged through the ship's plating, forcing the writhing Tyranid filaments to recoil, blackened and seared. For now, Gaius saw the bigger picture. The fleet was losing, the plan to stall the Tyranids was failing, and his ship was one of the few still intact. A moment of calculation, a moment of clarity.
Vargas,
he said.
Do we have torpedoes ready?
Vargas checked his screens, then nodded once.
3 loaded and primed.
Gaius turned to Voss.
We're taking out a capital bioship,
he said simply. Voss inhaled sharply.
That's suicide.
Gaius' lips pressed into a thin line.
We do it. Then we leave.
Voss nodded slowly, her voice grim.
Aye, Captain.
The order was given. The torpedoes launched, and hell followed. Aboard the Indomitable Wrath. Vandium Prime defense line. The torpedoes struck home. A blinding detonation of fire and biomatter erupted in the void, engulfing the massive Tyranid bioship in an expanding shockwave of white-hot energy. Plasma discharge seared through organic tendrils, rupturing chitinous plating, tearing the vessel apart in cascading explosions of liquefied tissue and superheated bone. It was a kill, a true, decisive kill. The bridge erupted in adrenaline-fueled relief.
Confirmed destruction,
Ren Vargas shouted, his voice carrying a rare edge of triumph.
The target is downed.
On the Vox, the remaining Imperial forces cheered, their voices fractured by static but unmistakable in their fury-born pride.
Indomitable Wrath. Your kill was clean. Emperor's blood. That was a damn fine strike.
For a brief moment the tide seemed to shift. They were still outnumbered. They were still dying. But now they had blooded the beast. And that was something. Then, in the middle of the chaos, Hale's voice broke through the temporary triumph.
Captain, enemy biosignature incoming.
The moment of victory vanished. The Tyranid bioship came from below, darting like a void-born predator, small compared to its larger kin. no more than a frigate-sized horror of flesh and bone. And it was moving too fast.
Brace!
Voss roared. A sickening, wet impact thundered through the Indomitable Wrath. The world shook. The ship lurched violently, the force of the impact throwing officers against bulkheads, sending servo skulls spinning wildly, scattering data slates and cogitator runes across the deck. Gaius slammed against his command pulpit, feeling his ribs crack under the pressure.
Damage report.
He shouted over the alarms, pushing himself upright. Hale's voice was hoarse, filled with static from his console's sparking circuits.
Direct hit on the aft engine cluster. Primary thrusters are...
He stopped, rechecking his console, his face going white.
Gone.
Silence fell over the bridge. Not from noise. The ship was screaming with klaxons, burning relays, and garbled vox transmissions, but from realization. They weren't moving. The Indomitable Wrath was dead in the void. The bridge crew froze as if refusing to accept it.
We can reroute auxiliary thrusters.
Vargas said quickly, his mind already racing.
Divert power from...
Negative.
Reavers 9 cut in coldly as he entered the bridge, his metallic voice flat, absolute.
The propulsion cores are destroyed. There is no means of restoring forward momentum.
Gaius turned to Vale.
Helm, maneuvering thrusters.
Vale's hands hovered over dead controls, his face uncharacteristically vacant.
Nothing, Captain.
His voice was hollow.
The ship's just... drifting.
There was a pause, stretching between them too long to be real. Then Yast's voice cracked through the suffocating air.
Ophath.
They all turned toward the viewport, and there in the madness of the battlefield they saw it. A Tyranid monstrosity, vast, towering, hideous, moving with the slow inevitability of a glacier consuming a valley. It was coming for them. The battle raged around them, but now they were no longer part of it. The Imperial fleet was still firing, still dying, still fighting a war of attrition they could not win. But the Indomitable Wrath. The Indomitable Wrath was nothing. A ruined ship adrift, waiting to be devoured.
Emergency distress beacon. Activate it.
Gaius barked, moving toward the Vox station. Jace's hands were already flying across the controls, sweat beading down his forehead.
It's broadcasting, but there's no response.
No one was coming for them. And the Tyranid ship was still moving. The bioship was unlike anything they had seen before. A horror of flesh, its massive frame twisted with organic ridges, its hideous mouth pits pulsating as they ingested wreckage. Corpses, Imperial war machines, anything that drifted into their grasp. Its tendrils extended like a kraken from hell, slowly unfurling, reaching for the ruined Imperial frigate.
Firing solutions.
Gaius asked, his voice cold, despite the rising panic in the air.
Lance batteries offline.
Vargas responded, his tone bordering on despair.
Macro cannons unresponsive.
We are defenseless.
Reavers 9 confirmed without emotion. For the first time in the depths of the bridge, true panic set in.
We need to abandon ship.
Solace said, her voice taut with a Medicae's instinct for survival.
We get to the escape pods.
And what?
Vargas snapped, turning to face her.
Do we launch into open void? We're too far from the fleet. If we abandon ship, we'll be picked off one by one.
We die if we stay here.
We die either way.
The words shook the bridge. The room fell deathly silent. From his pulpit, Gaius watched the bioship close the distance. His mind was calculating, assessing everything, every option, every tactic, every possibility. And there were none. No moves left to make. He turned toward Voss. Their eyes met.
Captain?
She asked, a voice softer than ever before. His hands clenched behind his back.
Hold your positions.
Voss closed her eyes.
Aye, sir.
The crew remained at their stations. The Tyranid bioship loomed, blotting out the void beyond. Jast was still whispering into the Vox.
Fleet Command, do you read? Fleet Command, please,
No one answered. Vale's fingers hovered over dead controls, staring at the thing that would consume them. Solus's breath trembled. Revis 9 simply stared ahead, unblinking. And then, the Tyranid ship opened its massive, grotesque maw. The tendrils surged forward, and the Indomitable Wrath was swallowed whole.
Okay guys, hopefully you enjoyed it. The second part. There'll be a third part coming up pretty soon. And then I'll have the full audiobook released after that. And I'll do some commentary probably on there, but I'm trying to keep the commentary pretty short. Thank you to all the new subscribers. We made it to 1,000 again. That's pretty fucking cool. Yeah. I hope you guys are enjoying the story so far. More coming. Stay tuned. Like, comment, subscribe, all this stuff. And I hope you have a nice night or rest of your day. Alright, I'll see you soon. Thank you.